Okay, so we'll start again. So good evening everybody, and thank you for coming down for this October edition of Coin Scrub, which we are focusing on Ordinals and BRC20 token standards and tokens. If you haven't heard of Ordinals as of yet, or BRC20, then the speakers that we have tonight will be tapping into what those are and going through their experience in dealing with them. And the first of our speakers is a very esteemed person within the crypto, blockchain and Bitcoin space, also on the Ethereum side of things as well, and actually helped to co-found the first Ordinals inscription service. So I'm going to welcome to the stage Mr. Toby Lewis, who will be taking it away. Please give him a round of applause.
Very good. Yep.
Alright, cool. Can everybody hear?
Very good. Well, good evening, everyone, and great. I've been to so many of these Coin Scrub meetups, so I'm really delighted actually to be on stage at one. For me, this year has felt like the year of Ordinals, perhaps for other people. Actually, quite interestingly, who in this room owns an Ordinal? Okay, so and who owns a BRC20? Okay, so we've got, which means you could have put your hand up for Ordinals, right? So interesting. So obviously, which I think is going to be really fascinating. So we're going to be exploring Ordinals and BRC20 tokens. Are they an innovation, bug, or feature? And is this perfect? So in February this year, effectively, and in January, the Ordinals protocol came out, but by about mid-February, I think probably many of you will remember that the largest block on Bitcoin ever came out, and it was a slowed down Bitcoin for a decent period of time. So this was done by a guy called Casey Rodimer, who came up with an idea of leveraging Taproot that was a upgrade to Bitcoin that effectively allowed more data to be stored alongside individual sats. And I guess the purpose of this is we're allowed to layer content onto the Bitcoin blockchain. Many think it's a major advancement for the Bitcoin blockchain ecosystem. I think there's still some detractors, but it's what I thought immediately was very cool is you could suddenly have data stored on Bitcoin, and I think if people know about how decentralized storage has been working, still probably the most popular platform is IPFS, and there's another platform called Outweighing, and by estimates, I think from the Filecoin Foundation that runs IPFS, roughly 1.5% of the overall storage market is now decentralized storage. However, if you've been playing around in like Ethereum or other ecosystems, effectively the problem you run into is like Ethereum, most sort of data stored in Ethereum or NFTs stored in Ethereum or whatever are actually going to an endpoint on IPFS, Arweave, or even in a kind of pretty much to an AWS server. And you probably the easiest way to think about this is the FTX NFTs. The moment FTX went down, they stopped paying whatever server costs they did, and all their all the people who bought these weird FTX NFTs ended up having a page saying this is now the property of the US government or something like that. It's quite funny. So the really nice thing about the Ordinals play in a very basic way of thinking is this is endpoints of data stored onto Bitcoin that in theory should be decentralized forever unless Bitcoin gets hacked, Bitcoin goes down, and for various technical reasons on Ethereum that's harder. So groups like Art Blocks and others have tried to store things on Ethereum, but just generally Ethereum is great for like referencing to other areas due to the smart contract functionality, but what Ordinals has basically done has turbocharged NFTs on Bitcoin. So effectively decentralized NFTs, data points, playfulness, and we'll get to the BRC20s in a minute. But I think it's what I think most exciting about it is that it's really turbocharged innovation within Bitcoin, and I think has demonstrated quite a clear use case to a lot of people. So it allows Bitcoin to be more versatile and allows it to be more utility. I think we've got some funny, probably the biggest like art project, the kind of punks of Ordinals are on the bottom right, which is the Ordinal Maxi Biz, that seem quite popular. The trade for like 0.1 of a Bitcoin or 0.2 of a Bitcoin probably at the moment, so which is $4,000. So it's not still slightly ridiculous for JPEGs. And as someone pointed out, we had a speaker who was giving it at my last conference on the whole ordinal side of things, and when people were sort of making the use case for NFTs on Bitcoin, this was more of an institutional focused conference, and one of my guests said I could see people's eyes rolling at the idea of just NFTs on Bitcoin. It just wasn't that exciting to a lot of the group, but I think through this talk I'm going to try and give the case to even if you're a skeptic, if not. The other thing on the left-hand side is Satoshables, which was a nice little early project done by my co-founder at Ordinals Bot, where we did some of the early like first 50,000 inscriptions were put onto Bitcoin, and it was an earlier NFT project. But I think this graph is pretty interesting, just in terms of it's showing transaction volumes on Bitcoin, and one of the really interesting things about Bitcoin is a lot of Bitcoin never moves, right? Like it's I think it was one of the institutional players who came into Bitcoin, maybe Paul Tudor Jones, some hedge fund guy, and he basically went, oh wow, when Bitcoin went down from like 20K to 3K in the last like 2017, 2018 to 2020, 2021, basically no one sold. So this is an asset class where things went down 80% in value, and just no one really cared. They just believed it's kind of like a cult, right? Like they just hold the thing. However, with Ordinals, as you can see, like the thing on the chart is about here, and effectively you've begun to see people doing things on Bitcoin for pretty much the first time, other than the movement of money around, right? Like Bitcoin was always a slightly boring blockchain. I think the amazing in many ways, and really, but clearly in from 2015, 2016, the action for the builders was very much gravitated around Ethereum and where it was going, and then Bitcoin was all about like preserving a very, very stable chain. But I think what has happened during the whole of 2023 is there's been a lot of very experienced builders looking at the very unique things in and around Bitcoin, and that's encouraged a lot of transactions and people playing around with what goes on in Bitcoin. And then I think my gut is whenever that kind of thing happens in an innovative market, you get things getting more exciting. And we're having, from an Ordinals bot perspective, a lot of talks with the miners, the exchanges, going like what does this mean? What tooling will be built out, and then looking at what tooling we can build around it. But I guess from a kind of Bitcoin consensus, Bitcoin security standpoint, the most important thing is due to the halving, effectively miners' revenues always halve, right? Like every 3 or 4 years as the halving happens. And what you need is then a steady fee market for Bitcoin to come about. And the really interesting thing is lots of people have tried to build that fee market on Bitcoin. Ordinals, like we were talking, one of the biggest Bitcoin miners in the world, and without a doubt, right or wrong, and there's lots of technical reasons that we might dive into with people in this room why Ordinals have some drawbacks. But the most interesting thing was this miner basically went, actually, it's the only time that an alternative fee market for Bitcoin has developed. And in probably the spike of activity on transaction volume that we seem to be approaching more or less again, which is interesting as Bitcoin heads to 35K for the first time in a couple of years. It feels quite nice, I imagine, for a few people in the room. In May, for the first time, miners' revenues from fees overtook miners' revenues from mining, right? Which was pretty extraordinary. And I think you can see from that chart that you may have the conditions for that, especially when you have the next halving, for that to become very much more a thing. So I think that's quite an important chart. Also, looking at this is just Ordinals inscriptions, and it's the black line is cumulative, looking at total inscriptions. This is looking at daily inscription. So clearly, it's a speculative market, still going in waves, but pretty extraordinary that you've had something take place this year, and people are spending good money on this, and sometimes you can spend on our platform upwards of $200 plus, right? And there's been 40 million of these things, more or less, inscribed, right, during the course of 1 year, which is pretty astounding. And then, as you can see, it kind of goes in waves. I think through October, it's been a low period. I think it will probably pick up as the nature of these sort of things happen. Is you normally get a spike in the asset, be it Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever, and then you get the underlying innovators beginning to play around a bit more. So I wouldn't be, if you look at recent activity on Ordinals, it's very much back to kind of April style levels, but I suspect it will hockey stick up more. And I kind of feel it's a market that very much reminds me of CryptoKitties era Ethereum, right? Like CryptoKitties took down Ethereum. There was a huge buzz and excitement running up to that and around that, but the market was extremely early. But then from there, obviously, we know that like I think NFTs as a market did roughly like 6 billion plus in volume over the last few years of transactions, which is pretty astounding for something that's still very much in its infancy. And so I think you're like in the peak of like Ordinal summer of May, you probably saw like $1 billion market cap BRC20 market. It was kind of crazy. It kind of broke Bitcoin. I think a lot of people recognized it didn't work. The rails weren't there. And so then the hype died down because something wasn't quite real. But I think we've got a lot here to explore as to what's under the hood. So another very interesting, like this is the BRC20 area is probably the use case of ordinals that has probably slightly frustratingly and from an ordinals bot perspective, like my guys were like one of our CTO was very anti the idea of like fungible tokens taking off on Bitcoin. It was kind of like something he kind of wanted to go, hey, from an ordinals bot perspective, can we steer this in a way that we don't get like some of the casino elements that I think people have been less happy with in some ways about the Ethereum ecosystem. But actually, like what's interesting is I think the Domo and the BRC20 crew have been very. I mean, they clearly, and we'll look at some of the data over usage. They clearly caught a wave, and like branding, it does what it says on the tin. BRC20 versus ERC20, fungible tokens on Bitcoin. It's an interesting market. I think it's. One of the really nice things about it, it was set up to be very fair launch friendly. So effectively, you can inscribe a BRC20 and you're not being kind of circumvented by the VCs or whatever. So it's a very crypto native, crypto open design, typically 4 characters. And as I said, at its peak was above $1 billion market cap as a kind of token trading tool. I think it's quite interesting. I think it's very much lacking in utility at the moment as a group, but I think there's a lot of very smart people that I'm dealing with who are going, like, how do we push forward like the BRC20 area? Probably the best known exchange in the ordinal space is a wallet and an exchange called Unisat. Captured a lot of the BRC20 area. We've been shipping quite a few BRC20s. When they do catch a wave, they're very, very popular. Some of the most popular, there was an early one called Aldi, that's still quite popular, traded on a lot of the centralized exchanges. Another one called Sats that kind of mirrored the entire Bitcoin blockchain. But just generally interesting. You're getting fungible tokens of Bitcoin. They've got like one of the major reasons why Ordinals kind of took down Bitcoin in May, more or less, was because there was a BRC20 craze. It's not very efficiently engineered, and I think there's work by Domo and the BRC20 crew to try and make that more efficient for Bitcoin and for their market. But it's been, I think the numbers don't lie, right? Like the red here is showing BRC20 mints. I think it's been the first use case that has taken on huge appeal beyond like images, text, other sort of JSON like type things. I think you've seen quite a popular domain service, which is .sats. Obviously, like storing images on Bitcoin has been popular. We did a funding raise a bit ago, and like we've been thinking about putting our share certificates on Bitcoin just for fun. But like I think there's different people like talking about putting like, I don't know, genetic data or whatever. Like I think as ever you'll get interesting people building interesting use cases and protocols, and that's always what happens around nice early stage tech. I think becoming our tagline as a company at Ordinals Bot, it's data stored on Bitcoin forever. That's probably the real, like, I think the thing that I think will be most exciting about Ordinals is literally they're kind of welded to a SAT. You've got the data there. Unless you were to have a hard fork of Bitcoin, which wouldn't be, I think, in anyone's interest, you're effectively having that data put on SATs forever in a decentralized way. So in our view, it's definitely the most robust area of decentralized storage that's come about so far, and it's on the original blockchain of that we've cared about. So we're building a way to do that scalably with proven robust infrastructure. You could, from day one, we did it where you could use Lightning, so you could. An interesting thing about Ordinals, effectively, you've got a kind of first is first principle, so you can basically the first person who does it does a particular inscription in a sort of codified manner, sort of effectively wins that priority, which became very popular in the kind of early speculative days of Ordinals, and one of our coders, when I interviewed him, had quite an interesting take on it. It's kind of like the way to think about ordinal theory is kind of like you could almost have like pi or prime numbers overwritten over ordinals, and you could begin playing around with it. But it's a very much kind of sequential way of viewing order in Bitcoin, and I think it's got some. Just because the way it's been articulated, it's been a way of codifying how data is stored on Bitcoin. So Matt, I don't know. You just stop. Okay, perfect. So yeah, we can allow you, like, this is all stuff that we can share the slide decks with people coming along here, but like effectively, the tool allows you to inscribe files and images onto blockchain. We've got a lot of API infrastructure. We're coming out with a PSBT marketplace that effectively will allow anyone to set up a way to trade ordinals if they want. We've been working on scanning a lot of rare sats as well. This is a really, really interesting concept that I think has resonated with a lot of people, even outside of like people wanting to store data onto Bitcoin. Basically, Casey, who came up with ordinal theory, also came up with this concept of rare sats. So this is like the Rodimer rarity category, and then people have resonated with this idea, and we allow people to inscribe onto uncommon sats. We've been building a sat scanner we've also been like running algos to effectively just harvest these rare sats as well. But basically, the first sat on every block at its peak was trading for like $1,000, and given that in actual monetary Bitcoin value, that would be like cent / microcents. It's pretty interesting, right? And now I think they can go for 300, but you also get like the first sat of every halving, things that have been in Hal Finney's wallet, things that have been in Satoshi's wallet, and interestingly, like we chatted with a lot of investors in this space, and the rare sats area, like we're very heavy into the rare sats tooling and enabling people to inscribe onto rare sats, but also harvest rare sats, just because like any Bitcoiner might not totally resonate with the ideas and concepts around ordinals, but like very unique to Bitcoin is that sequential UTXO sort of numbering where effectively data is corresponding to each individual sat on the blockchain, and so you can track the history of Bitcoin forever. So I think we've ended up now getting like 450 million pizza sats from this hoovering, so from the original Bitcoin pizza transaction. So you might remember like someone decided to buy some couple of pizzas with 10,000 Bitcoin, cost them 35 million in today's money. I hope the pizzas are good, basically.
So sorry, you're saying there's value in knowing the provenance of the citations?
Exactly, and very clearly, it's there's been market demand. I think it's one area that is likely to be uncontestable in terms of like as this idea resonates more, and like we're talking with a lot of the miners, a lot of the centralized exchanges, and so there's getting a market. Obviously, like the prices for those things go up and down. Like pizza sats, for instance, aren't actually very scarce. That was why I was saying like we managed to like a tiny little startup harvest like 450 million of them, but like a lot of these.
So how do you know when you want to harvest that? So you'll know the wallet that one of those sits in. So then you'll go to whichever marketplace that is, and then you'll say, look, I bought X number of citations that I want to take delivery of. You nominate which ones you want to take.
You can't nominate, but you can just move Bitcoin around and then sift it. Like the way we think about it is like gold panning. Like it's been a very valuable market for gold panning in the first 6 months because with a tiny little niche. But as that widens out, it becomes much harder, and even like Binance or whatever has been saying, oh, we're going to try and sift all of our rare sats or whatever. But the tooling around it is probably in like a handful of companies that like ours that have been like working on just in a very clean way, knowing which ones are rare, which ones have value in the market. We have that nice position where like a lot of people are coming to us and going like, okay, you can come to the Ordinals bot website and subscribe onto like a Hal Finney sat or a pizza sat right away. And then we work with people doing collections or whatever. An interesting trend we did like with the Ordinals core team, so Casey and there's another program called RAF and a bunch of others, got us to do their balloons collection, and they were really keen. They're really into astrology. Something that would be quite intriguing to people is like basically like you can now have astrological stats on an auspicious date. If you're into like Cancer, Capricorn, whatever it is, you can inscribe onto that astrological stat, and that's caught fire as triggering people's imagination because it can be valuable to them, it can be valuable to their child, it can be valuable to like a particular date that they care about. That is almost like it's provenance that has value in a context, right? But,
leaves that context. A lifetime ago, we used to take a number of different block.
Yeah.
And if it was in Liverpool, we'd say that's too far away. If it was in Hamburg, we'd say that's brilliant. That's great kind of stuff. So, but there, the problem, the value of the problems was the proximity to ship care on. If I have a banknote that's being handled by the government of England, rather than my conscience, if I've got a situation that's been used like this, I don't subscribe to that.
well, it depends on your view, right? And the collectors of rare coins in traditional world would disagree with you as well, right?
Yeah.
Postage stamps and whatever, right? Like that. The really interesting thing is, like, for whatever reason, the very clear history of blockchains do resonate with a collector's mindset, but then some other people just don't care, right? And it could be, and that's what you see as well, like in this SAT scanning. People don't really know very much about like coin control of their Bitcoin or keeping hold of these rare things as well, especially in the early days. There was very limited wallet infrastructure designed to keep up with that. So people then ended up inscribing these things and then not storing them properly and then giving them back into the system with taking 0.5% instead of like the 0.1 Bitcoin that the thing might be trading on the market, right? But anyway, so we've worked with a lot of people like Alex, Lever, different people all around the place, and yeah, looking one very interesting thing that we've been leading the market a bit on is we've done a lot of like this parent-child provenance in the Ordinals area, where effectively if you're launching some form of collection, you have effectively a parent SAT that unifies the entire collection, and we've been building tooling first to, like, at the moment we're still doing this manually, but we did it for the group, like the main Ordinals team, for their Blooms collection, which is a big art collection that they've been launching. But at the same time, like, I think what you're going to get is a lot of gamification of hierarchy, and people have come up with this parent-child model that we're automating very shortly. Race around, pretty happy about that. And then we've been developing tools for the community, like just ways like you can put any markdown that you want on Bitcoin. We've got our equivalent of like the Bitcoin clock, or the Ordinals clock, where you can just basically look at how many Ordinals, like where we are in the Ordinals cycle. It was inspired by the debt clock that probably many of you know in New York, but it was just like to get a ticker on that. And we come up with, like, there was this Bitcoin faces trend with algorithmic faces. Within a day, we built a tool that you could very quickly spin up your own. So have a chat about some stuff on Ordinals very happy to delve into a discussion generally about the topic.
Thank you very much, Toby. Do you have any questions? Any other questions before Toby pushes up here?
And there is going to be a panel afterwards.
Yeah.
But if anyone wants a question okay.
With the inscribing requirements of SATs, can that be sort of in this tax be changed or something?
Really good point.
Great Britain, say I know you the partners that have some ESG mandates, or you want clean coins happening through the government to mine renewable energy. So that can be tagged with like an ESG thing, but then if it hops again and then it gets remonitored and not within those parameters, then it change.
So I don't think you can reinscribe on something on a SAT. So once a SAT has been inscribed on, that etching has been done. But you can obviously store other bits of data, and there's other metadata that's going to come around that anyway. And then I guess in terms of the provenance that the people are gravitating around is like, if something was mined in a green manner, it can't then be reversed. It either was or it wasn't, right? So you'll get people tracking tools on that, and people are working a lot on a lot of those parameters, but typically there's one inscription on a particular SAT. I don't think there's a way to reverse that.
Thanks, Tony. At what point does this break the economic model of Bitcoin? Because at some point, if everyone's storing their share certificates and various junk on them, there's got to be a point where the state will get to become a problem.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. Well, I think the question is, it just becomes more expensive to store, right? Like so the interesting thing is, it almost naturally weeds out. It sort of gravitates towards higher value items and things that you want to store on Bitcoin than before, right? So I'd say it doesn't ever break, but Bitcoin on-chain Bitcoin transactions necessarily become more expensive, but that's almost like the design of Bitcoin, right?
The size of the files isn't necessarily mediated by the fee market, though, right? It's like the full node is bearing the cost of the state storage, and that's not necessarily directly connected to the fee market price at that time.
But you can only store 4 megabytes on each block anyway, right? And then what people are doing. So one of the big things that has, I guess people have been finding ways to work around this. So for example, you've had this concept of recursive inscriptions where people are effectively putting like HTML text and then referring amongst each other and looking at ways to bring down the size. So basically, like the almost like I think Nat referenced Udi, who I think was the guy who led to this 4 megabyte block, right? Like being put onto Bitcoin. Udiocy, it's called, because they are like slightly there. If you've ever seen them, they're dressed up in wizard costumes and being a bit silly. But like that he's also quite a famous Bitcoin programmer, and at the same time, like when he did that 4 megabyte block to make a statement and slowed down all the Bitcoin, what you've seen is actually then most people go, actually, I want to make the file size really, really small, and then look at HTML and things to build on top, where Bitcoin still becomes the area of record, but you're trying to compress stuff as much as they can, but still block space is expensive, so it will by necessity be over time as there becomes more demand to store stuff onto Bitcoin. It will only become higher value items, right? Like so. Cool. Well, we're doing a panel later as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Toby. Can I get another round of applause for Toby, please? Okay, so coming up next, our next speaker is somebody who's very well known within the space and making quite a few moves within the space recently. And thank you very much, Toby, for bringing him through tonight so we can discuss more about Ordinals and BRC20 Tokens. So, Mohammed, nice to meet you for the first time, and he'll be going into animal brands, a bit of what he does, and also BRC20s and how Ordinals is getting into gaming and the metaverse. So, round of applause for all.
Yes, it is. So, thank you everyone for coming out today. I know it's a cold Wednesday afternoon, but you guys are all here, so much appreciated for that. So, I'm Mohammed Ozuddin. I'm head of tokenomics at Animal Brands. If you haven't heard of us, like Animal Brands, our vision is an open, decentralized metaverse where digital ownership is really at the heart of that. We have an ecosystem of over 450 portfolio companies, approximately 20 subsidiaries, and really all pushing towards this open metaverse today, where something you'll hear us say quite often is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. What I'll do is I'll touch briefly on tokenomics and the relevance of what, then find out why that is relevant to BRC20, Ordinals, and our view around that, and then something exciting we're doing with one of our flagship subsidiaries. So, tokenomics, a buzzword. And if you were to go around the room asking what everyone thought tokenomics meant, we probably have a few different definitions of what it means. So, I have 2 young children, and the way I like to explain what tokenomics is that it's actually a line from Shrek. It's like an onion. There are so many different layers to it. When I went into the space in 2017, it was a pie chart. And if you had advanced tokenomics, you maybe had a distribution schedule. That was it. We've come a long way since then. But quick show of hands, how many of us still think tokenomics is just a pie chart and an allocation/distribution schedule? Yes. Oh. How many of us have no idea what tokenomics is as well? Just to give me a gauge of where the room is at. Okay, I appreciate the honesty. How many of us think we have a good idea of what tokenomics is? Excellent. How many people are here for the pizza? All right, there we go. I appreciate the honesty. So, what we've seen from an evolutionary perspective is, and this is outside of layer 1 tokenomics per se, there's been allocation, distribution, but fundamentally what we haven't seen is any token economic model, again, outside of Bitcoin and maybe Ethereum, that has been successful. And a big reason for that is we haven't applied basic rules of economics to that, to then find an economy that can scale over time. There's been multiple reasons for the lack of a worthy tokenomic model. Part of that reason is the nature of the space. I remember when I got in 2017, a friend sent me the Bitcoin white paper. I'm like, this is amazing. I've got 2 degrees in mathematics and I just solved Byzantine's general problems. And ICOs popped up and I'm like, forget Bitcoin, time to make some money. Rode the wave up and down. I was like, oh, okay, what if I lost most of my money? This is super interesting. Part of it was for being rugged. Part of it was then discovering, and actually someone I went down the tokenomics rabbit hole, Dr. Nick, who's in the audience as well. It was great to have you for a few years bouncing ideas around high-level tokenomics model. I think we solved World Fund 2 or 3 times as well in that period of time. But no, all jokes aside, it was realizing that projects were raising funds, giving out a big chunk of tokens to investors, and then the hype cycle. I mean, back in 2017, 2018, a few names: Superman, Ian Bellina, BitBoy, who somehow still around but changed his name, and a few others without throwing shade on anyone. It was just like, who was tweeting first? And that was tokenomics back then, or a variation or a version of tokenomics. Fast forward to where we're at today, it's really understanding the different stakeholders within an ecosystem. And if we've tried to split it up into 3 stages, or 0 to 1 stage, where are we pre-product? Where are we pre-token generation? What are the different stakeholders? What are the base and core utilities? And when I say utilities, it's a governance token. People are going to come in and vote. We've seen that hasn't really been working. So governance by itself, is it a utility? Debatable. But where else can we have a true need for a token? Is there an underlying product? Is there an underlying community? A lot of times what we've seen since the rise of NFTs is, and I use Bored Ape as an example, because they have an NFT, but there's also a token associated with the ecosystem. The rise of PFPs have allowed people to associate with one another. So if I hold a specific PFP from a collection like that in a Bored Ape, I don't. And I can see other people on Twitter or social media holding the same PFP, it became a lot easier to connect, and that where that true sense of community came about. It's very difficult to say as a launch Bitcoin or Apecoin, I hope, we're in the same community, and a lot easier to do that with NFTs. And what that really gave us was a base for building communities, but communities alone without a viable product are not enough to sustain a token economy, as we've seen in the price decrease over the past 18 months. I guess since FTX, calamities day that FTX happened. Back to the point, 0 to 1. You need a community, you need a product, you need to have other stakeholders where speculators play a role in that because they provide liquidity, but ultimately cannot be the main actor within this ecosystem. Because what we've seen if a speculator is the main persona, as we like to call it within an ecosystem, you're doomed to fail before you develop, because everyone's in it for the money. They're in it for the 2x, the 5x, the 10x. They're not in it truly for that ecosystem. And after that, once a token is live, so what we call from 1 to 10, so to speak, is how can we then leverage genuine on-chain data? Everything from 0 to 1 is hypothesis testing. We think this is going to work. This is why some experience or some data from previous failed experiments, you can say, from different projects. 1 to 10 is we now have our own on-chain data, and we can really leverage growing a community based around how they're interacting with a product to tweak the sinks and faucets or the burns and earns or spends and earns, depending on which lingo you use. And then that's when you really hit a critical mass, and that's sort of what you can say we've seen with Bitcoin and with Ethereum, that there's a critical mass of users within that ecosystem that truly allow for a form of economy to really start to take scale. And then 10 to 100 or 10 plus is something we haven't really seen as of yet. But that's when you can start comparing again, Bitcoin aside, when you can think of the market cap as a GDP and really start to have comparisons between where we're at today and where a lot of the most formidable, I want to say, formidable in the eyes of Web2, not necessarily Web3, economies that exist as of now. Again, the one of the US dollar is on its way down, but that's a story for another day. So a bit of background on tokenomics, sort of where our minds are at from that aspect. How does that relate to Bitcoin, BRC20?
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hit me, it's fine.
I'm trying to understand what you're saying.
Yes.
So it's interesting. You
Yes.
raise something about the integrity of the product or the integrity of the token,
Yes.
and then you raise something about the transfer of data.
Absolutely.
So the integrity is one thing, and I'm wondering if you look at what the Treasury said about consultation on, which rate is acceptable or not acceptable, and then the other thing, the transfer of data. Have you even looked at anything like market use regulation and how people behave in these transfers? Because I see a lot of behaviour which is not normally acceptable in the traditional market.
I couldn't agree more with you, but then it's down, there's a number of different questions there to answer, so that's a question for you. What does value mean to you?
Any transfer relationship, so value can be up or down. So for me, it's all I'm trying to do is split apart the integrity of the product.
Yes.
So one thing is saying this is a good token, this is a good project, this is a good thing, and there's all sorts of disclosures around that. The other thing is the trading or any transaction with that token, and it's where transactions happen.
Speculation from bad actors. So I think bad actors exist regardless if it's cryptocurrency, fiat currency, prior to cryptocurrency. If you want to go buy drugs on the corner, you're more likely to be dealing in fiat than you are in cryptocurrency. So I think there's a counter argument there that cryptocurrency isn't bad, there are bad actors who leverage it because of the lack of regulation around it. I think it's probably a more solid argument in that sense. I also think, again, we can agree to disagree. There's no issues with that. But really, when launching a token, I think maybe to answer the point, it really depends on the jurisdiction. So what we're seeing was some of the legal regulations that will be coming to the EU. They have a slightly different thought process as to what constitutes a utility token. Again, Swiss Foundation has a slightly different definition. The US with the Howey test, again, slightly different definition. So it really depends on where the core user base is for that ecosystem and how you want to stay clear of security laws, if you do not see yourself as a security, or maybe if you are a security, there are security token platforms out there, like Republic, like Soma, I think is another one where you can launch a token that is an outright security. So there are solutions there. But the other side of it is we are still early. I know when I went in 2017, people were like, you're still early, I don't think into 3K. How am I early? Given a lot of the innovation we've seen since January, February time of this year, and also which will be a good segue into my next point, it's the innovation on Bitcoin has allowed for a new way of thinking, a dynamical thinking on Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin is always seen as one of two things. Either it's money, it's value in that aspect, or it's a medium of exchange, or it's a store of value. And I remember I've got a few Bitcoin maxi friends, or laser rides as they're called. They were looking with a lot of jealousy at the Ethereum ecosystem as more money was pumped into Ethereum because you were able to build on Ethereum, which was great. Which I said, well, we want some of that transaction. We want our sats, our Bitcoins to pump by being able to have this layer on top of Bitcoin being built. And we've seen different upgrades throughout the Bitcoin ecosystem, throughout the Bitcoin segway, and then the Lightning upgrades. But it wasn't until Casey, and I know Toby's touched on this already, so I won't go too deeply into this, with Ordinal theory, and then with the BRC20, we're seeing Room, we're seeing loads of other advancements in what can happen on Bitcoin, but really it's the rise of layer 2. So in Stacks, which came out three or 4 years ago, I think, was the first layer 2 on Bitcoin. It got some hype, a lot of criticism. We're starting to see ICP, or some big names in ICP, Internet Computer Protocol, which is the product from Infinity, trying to pivot as a layer 2 for people to be able to build on Bitcoin. So what we're really starting to see is this ability for us to build on money. If you think of Bitcoin as money or as value, for us to build on money, but not by building on money directly. Now that opens up a raft of possibilities. With us at local brands, we are blockchain agnostic. When we are looking to build an ecosystem with an underlying blockchain, it's fundamentally, does this chain have the needs or the wants for us to be able to build here? Is it interoperable? What does the scalability look like? And fast forward to, or rewind, from where we are now, just 3 months ago, one of our flagship subsidiaries, Life Beyond, we're building a AAA MMO RPG game, or experience if you like. The team is from Ubisoft, who worked on Assassin's Creed, a couple of the titles within the Assassin's Creed series, and they're building the first metaverse, or ecosystem metaverse on Bitcoin. Now when we look, think excellent, we've seen the advancements in technology, but we know we cannot actually build on Bitcoin. The smart contract functionality isn't there yet. We're not going to be there for a while. Pivoting, for anyone who is a builder in the space, if you're building on a layer 2, you are at the mercy of that layer 2. It's as simple as that. And Stacks is a great piece of technology, but there hasn't been adoption around it like you can argue maybe with Polygon from an Ethereum standpoint, and some of the other layer 2s on Polygon as well. So we decided, after the consultation with different people within the Bitcoin space, that a layer 3 makes the most sense. Now, what does a layer 3 constitute of? Now, we know Bitcoin is our settlement layer, so to speak. It's where we can derive the security from the chain. We have different layer 2s like Stacks, like ICP. We're seeing a lot more layer 2s that will evolve over the next 6 months, year, 2 years, moving into the future. And the purpose of this layer 3 is really to bring in this fractured ecosystem. Let's be honest, the Bitcoin ecosystem as of now is fractured. You have your laser eyes are against everything happening within the BRC, within the ordinal space. They just see Bitcoin as a store of value or medium of exchange. Then you have the rest of us who are just like, this is feeling awesome, there's so much innovation happening here. What can we do to truly push Bitcoin forward? And we also look at adoption rates of Bitcoin. How many countries have gone through hyperinflation? How many countries have been forced to adopt Bitcoin? My background is Egyptian, I have a lot of Lebanese friends, and after they went through their hyperinflation, a couple of months later I had a few reaching out, how do I buy Bitcoin? Like everyone in Lebanon is starting to adopt Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. What do I need to do? What are the next steps for me? So as we're seeing, there's been more adoption, forced adoption from a Bitcoin standpoint. I'll take a pause there for a moment, but I just want to rewind to 2020, the rise of Axie Infinity. How many of us remember Axie Infinity played to earn? Cool. How many of us thought it was a complete sham? How many thought it was a failed economic experiment? Okay, so some of us have heard of it. So Axie Infinity was the first game to release, or the first game that had mass adoption. And what really drove users, mainly in Southeast Asia and the Philippines, to play Axie was COVID. It was the fact that these guys, for want of a better word, were laborers. There was no more laboring work. They didn't live in a country that was the US, the UK, a forward-thinking country that could support its populace at the time. So they needed to fundamentally find another route or another way to work, to pay the bills, to have food on the table. And that's where Axie stepped in. So we've seen that if people are forced into a tight corner, they will adopt cryptocurrency as a means of payment or as a means of work, and as then a means of payment to be able to live, to be able to sustain themselves. So yes, it was a failed economic experiment, but it showed us that if people are put in that tight corner, they're able to do that. And back to the point of hyperinflation, a lot of people as of now, a lot of countries as of now are being forced into that, where their currencies are worthless and they've been forced to adopt Bitcoin, which is only good for the Bitcoin community. Back to the layer 3, sort of build up the steps slowly to where we're at. We have loads of different builders in the Bitcoin ecosystem. It's a fractured ecosystem. We have high adoption rates of Bitcoin in a lot of emerging countries. And now what we have is this behemoth and local brand, one of its flagship subsidiaries, Life Beyond, building the next layer 3, or building a layer 3 on Bitcoin. And the core purpose of the layer 3 really is to unite all of the builders who truly want an ecosystem, mainly around games and toolings for games, but leveraging what we've seen with Axie, or the potential of what can happen with Axie. And what this gives me a lot of my personal try. And what we're doing, it's not us per se that's building this outright, it is an ecosystem play. So we are looking for launch contributors. We're currently working with Horizon Labs. I've personally worked with Horizon Labs before for ApeCoin, so we know from a technical perspective they're good at what they do. But we're also looking at builders within the Bitcoin ecosystem. So we've spoken with Domo, we've spoken with Casey, we've spoken with a number of different builders in the Bitcoin ecosystem to really see how we can launch this layer 3 moving forward. So I'm going to pause there, and you're probably sick and tired of my voice, and I'll open it up to questions. But there might be a few questions in the audience, and I'll try and answer as many as I can, I promise.
Okay, who's first?
I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on the different economics models that you're beginning to see develop within this new space. In terms of like, you beginning to see any that are really fully vertical and worked out. I mean, I think.
No, not sure. No.
Quick answer.
No, not yet. We're beginning to see the foundations of some that might have what you're asking for, but nothing as of yet. And a big reason for that, something we haven't spoken about, is fundraising. Fundraising is a big issue. Because a lot of time what happens is it's the projects put the cart before the horse, where we need X amount to be able to go and build. Excellent, let's raise on token. And they've ended up selling 20, 30, 40% of the token supply to investors. In doing so, you've short-term excellent, medium to long-term, you've killed your token economy, because that translates to sell pressure. And fundamentally what happens is very short vesting schedules. You have investors and team dumping, there is no product, there is no buy pressure, and the token goes to zero. So that's a big reason why a lot of token economies have failed in the medium term, because of the way the funding happens. But we have seen a change in that. So a lot of projects or businesses now are raising on equity with a token warrant, and really they can control the percentage of tokens. And normally what we advise is single-digit percentages to investors, because they already have safety in the equity and then some liquidity in the token with longer vesting schedules. So that's the reason, well, that's one of the main reasons why we haven't seen successful token economy as of now, in addition to the space is full of speculators. So no one's in it to actually use the token for its core purpose. They're in it because they want the ROI.
Discussion?
So you mentioned about actually
Yes.
a failed project.
Failed experiment, not a failed project.
It's a failed experiment.
Yeah.
In trying to understand the company. And I think it's interesting to say that there was an explosion of different gaming metaverse projects and social issues programs associated with them that were intended to support different aspects of the gaming ecosystem being fair with obviously external markets within. But a lot of them, if you think about the current market value of those token issuances, is now very low. Many have lost the vast majority of the value that they had from the market peak. So just in terms of the projects that you're involved with or that you assist, what are the lessons that you've learned from looking at those projects and thinking about what has failed from those projects? And what do you think a hallmark that will build up a sustainable foundation for the gaming network as well?
I think great question. So I've alluded to two of those points already in terms of hard-earning tokens to investors. It's also having a big chunk of the initial token supply earmarked for the community. One of the other issues that I'll list a number of learnings that we've had. Growth is non-linear, yet token unlocks are very linear. So there's a big disparity there. But try explaining to investors what a non-linear unlock schedule based on the growth of the ecosystem, and instantly 99% of us like, when do I get my tokens? So there's still a big issue around the funding aspect. One of the other reasons is how many projects actually need a funding token? And the answer is hardly any, especially within gaming, where we're at now. What we're seeing is starting with a soft or hard currency that's in-game, that's not tradable. Because what we really want are the right users coming in, or the right personas coming in who are non-speculators, who are coming in to interact with the game ecosystem, or with any kind of ecosystem, for the underlying principles of that ecosystem. And then once there's critical mass, and critical mass varies from ecosystem to ecosystem, then it makes sense to sort of switch on your funding token tap, so to speak, and control the different variables as to what the emissions look like from that point. But investors, this is one of the big underlying struggles right now, where even if some investors are happy with the funding, they still want a token to go live sooner rather than later so they can have liquidity. So yeah, it's a catch-22, and there's not many projects that are funded, that are self-funded, for example, that the funding is just on equity with no promise for tokens. And yeah, there's a number of reasons, or a number of learnings that we've had there as of now. If you have a follow-up, hit me.
I'll say that for later.
Okay, fair enough. Okay.
I've been following Bitcoin DAO pretty closely lately, so I kind of know what they're doing from a governance and also API, AIP proposal perspective. But I'm more like just keen to hear a little bit more about your involvement in terms of with Horizon Labs. And so are you guys essentially sort of trying to be a gaming layer and then have a token and then need to work out the tokenomics of that? Just want you to elaborate on that front.
So we would launch contributors to ApeCoin.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we would launch contributors to ApeCoin. Yeah, our chairman and founder, he sat on the special council for the first 26 months, was extended to 9 months, and then there were elections. So that was our official involvement with ApeCoin. But we do hold a lot of ApeCoin, and what we're currently doing is delegating that to another of our flagship products or communities, Blockverse.
They got a big treasury.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think we initially allocated 1.5 million ape, but other holders in the space, without mentioning names, you said it, not me, increased his ape allocation, so we felt it was only fair if we increased our ape allocation.
Yeah.
We don't want to be the final say, but we do want to have a meaningful say within the ecosystem. And again, that was an experiment in terms of Blockverse and the integration with the ApeCoin community.
Yeah.
And after a rough start, there's been quite good assimilation between both communities, and a lot of Bored Ape holders or Mutant Ape holders or ApeCoin holders have gone out and bought Blockverse NFTs because they see the value of that. But since we're on the topic of Mochaverse, I'll spit a little bit of outline. AB holds, or Mocha Brands holds a lot of tokens on balance sheet, and fundamentally what the aim of the Mochaverse is to be the DAO of DAOs, where as different DAOs begin to grow, like it's in the growth of ApeCoin, we can leverage our token holdings to delegate tokens to Mochaverse, so it becomes your single point entry into the DAO space.
No. The other day they held a Twitter space, really brought a lot of different people together. Whereas ApeCoin, they typically hold their own Twitter space, but the other Twitter space, that I think they had like almost like a town hall sort of situation. It was a good discussion. Basically, it was one of the more productive discussion in terms of like discussing governance, tokenomics, where to allocate funds, etc. So it was pretty good. That's all. I know a guy called Matty Token. I don't know if you know.
Oh, I know Matty.
He's in London.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware, but he's
I know Matty.
He's a friend.
Is he? Matty's a great guy.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions before we move to the next section? One more.
I was interested to just peel back more on how you work. I think you were describing something that in the city, we would call it the free float. So if you raise equity, the bank and the company, they hold back a section of the equity. And then they alter the free float to sort of try and help liquidity in that stock. And I mean, that's obviously, there are examples of that all over the place in every stock market listing. Is your system trying to mimic that, or are you trying to learn from that, the way that works, and then apply it, or
It's yes and no. It's a difficult one because every project has a slightly different structure and slightly different raising mechanics. So there isn't a cookie cutter or one size fits all approach. So I'd say it's probably a hybrid of that, but fundamentally it's trying to have separation or clear separation between equity and token, and having investors come in on the equity where there's more security for the investors, but also getting some of the upside in the token, because they'll come in at a discounted value, a discounted price for the token, but making sure that the amount of tokens that investors are getting is minimal in terms of the impact it can have on the market cap of the token versus having a large chunk of those tokens. They're slightly different to what you were saying about the wolf some overlaps. We can follow up afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. Everybody, could you give Mohammed a round of applause? Back up as well, Mohammed. I think we'll go straight into the panel section because I can see that there are quite a few of you to answer some more questions. So we'll go down a short list of questions tonight with our panelists and see what their thoughts are and hopefully get some questions from you guys in the crowd as well. So first thing, I think we've explained what Ordinals are at this point in time. So can I ask when the two of you kind of came across Ordinals and how you kind of got into the Ordinals space at first?
Go for it. My story is a little short as well.
Yeah. So I think I was very keen on Ordinals from day one. I guess I ended up being co-founder of an Ordinal project 3 days after I heard about Ordinals, which is quite fun. So that's everyone says that the crypto years are like dog years, but this was a particular instance. So effectively, I probably found out when I think I might have been vaguely aware of Ordinals as a concept and a protocol and whatever, but the effectively when the 4 megabyte block dropped, my entire Twitter feed lit up, and when this is a great thing, and then I just happened to be very lucky. So I was advising the two founders of Ordinals Bot, who've been building a bunch of cool products in like the Bitcoin DeFi ecosystem, and they'd happened to be tinkering and had coded up a platform that was rocked and ready to go to automate how to inscribe an ordinal. And effectively, to inscribe an ordinal, you need to run a full Bitcoin node, which is not trivial, and you also need to be sequencing the ord client, so sort of effectively trawling all of Bitcoin's history. So it was an interesting lift, and we put out the product with the guys coded something over the weekend after that 4 megabyte block, dropped it on Monday, and promptly our site was crashed by because it went live with an API, went live with Lightning integration, and we effectively hosted the first proper large-scale mint, because another group who we're quite close partners with now in the Ordinals market launched Bitcoin punks at the time. So these were like between that, effectively looking at image recognition of the first people to inscribe the original Ethereum punks onto Bitcoin, and people who, because of the way that Ordinals work on the first basis, this became very popular. People were, okay, great, I can get a JPEG and I can own this thing that trades at probably now at 0.02 Bitcoin. Back in the bull run of Ordinals, it was 0.1 Bitcoin, and people like literally were using our tool to like ram as many of these things onto Ordinals as possible. So the guys were like slightly blown away by the level of people. Like we've had 108,000 wallets use our tool, which is pretty good. Like it's a very niche space. So 108,000 users might not sound like very much in like Web2 world, but in Bitcoin, which is a niche of a niche, Bitcoin DeFi is kind of like super tiny. It was a pretty strong product market fit. So I came on board to like go, look, we can build a business. We had a website, we didn't have a business. Took over the strategy role, led a funding round, and then started going like, how do we make this Ordinals bot relevant beyond just going, here's how to automate something on chain? Because what happened is the life cycle of Ordinals changed very, very quickly. So when we probably had a nice, we had a nice kind of week where we were the only viable tool that automated putting Ordinals on chain, and that was a great week. But ever since then, we've had like a headache of like, oh, wow, those guys coded that. How do we compete? And specifically on the BRC20 tokenomics point, we've done pretty well as a business on enabling people to do BRC20, but we were probably the market leader until BRC20 came about, and a group called udiocy came in and like effectively shipped a marketplace, a wallet, and an inscription tool for BRC20, and really like there's a lot of interesting points on the tokenomics of like the Bitcoin native tokenomics that we can perhaps discuss with Mohammed a bit later.
Yeah, I think for me it was hearing whispers on Twitter that I was actually at an event in Dubai on stage, and one of the panelists came late, eyes bloodshot red. Guys, I'm so sorry. I've been up all night inscribing Ordinals, and that was my moment of Ordinals. Like, hey, this is going to be big. So it was that was the moment for me to go, right, let me start researching a bit more, and then realizing that it's super early. And again, we've grown so much from February until today, and we're only going to grow some more.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think I noticed, I definitely noticed like sub 10K, because people were still talking about like, hey, you know, like we're going to reach 10K Ordinals. So I ran downstairs, like dusted off an old computer that I was running my Bitcoin node on, that I hadn't run for like a year. And I was like, yeah, let me try and get in there like sub 10K. And then I was like a whole software, after a whole day of updating the node, yeah, I was a whole software version behind, so I had to update. I think from 23 to 25, right? 25 is where you can inscribe. So I was like, okay, cool. Let me update to 25, and because it was an old Mac, I couldn't update to 25, right? So it was like, what do? I turned around and the next day, Ordinals bought. It was like, oh my god, yes, I could inscribe sub 10k. So yeah, I've got a few like random inscriptions that are like sub 10k, sub 30k. So
and those are all quite valuable, right? And that was really cool. Like one of the things in the ordinal space is a lot of people still resonate with Ordinals bot in a big way because like they're like, especially if they were as early as Nat, they definitely were using our tool because and a lot of people had the same problem as Nat, is they might have even had their own Bitcoin node running, but they just didn't have the infrastructure to do it. So we were lucky that we had a few of those elements ready to go, and then could scale around that. And then I think that's it's interesting, like that infrastructure piece. Like we worked with like Magic Eden when they launched their marketplace came to us, and that was really nice because they had a team of 12 programmers, a lot of sophistication. Just the 12 programmers were in a room discussing Ordinals. So which and the group had like 200 million of funding, and they went away and went, we're going to launch a marketplace and we're going to use your API in the background because it's actually too much of a heavy lift. So one of the nice things about like the Ordinal space is it has that it has some moats for the builders that mean that you can build stuff that because Bitcoin is hard, it can be a blessing.
And literally from the time that they launched Ordinals, it was like every day. It was like 30,000 inscriptions, and it was 60,000, it was 100,000, it was 200,000. Like, and all of this happened probably within the space of a couple of months. So what maybe 2 months at best, we were over like 1 million inscriptions. So it is certainly something that, as Toby said earlier on, has already kind of taken off in a big way, but you can see how the growth cycle will work when it becomes a lot more easily accessible and people start doing more with them. So overall then, guys, how would you say that Ordinals or BRC20 tokens have changed the game? Like, what would be your like one thing to say that has definitely changed the game?
I don't think they've changed the game yet. From my perspective, I think they have changed the game, but they haven't changed it on the scale that we want to see from that aspect. And I think it's something that Toby spoke about earlier, and it's fundamentally the miners and the transaction costs, because a lot of miners have been running at a deficit. So fundamentally, it's how can miners keep on mining? And I'm not talking about your large institutional miners, I'm talking about your everyday miners. And that's allowed, it's begun to show us a solution towards that, but what it's also shown us is we can access the slot liquidity on Bitcoin. There's a lot of Bitcoin holders, again, another point that Toby mentioned, is that they don't move their Bitcoin. Like when the drop happened from 20k to 3k, talk about diamond hands. This is true diamond hands. And the Bitcoin community is the OG diamond hands community. So it's how can you access that lot of liquidity from the OG community, but also from the newer participants within the Bitcoin ecosystem who have been forced to adopt Bitcoin, not because it solves all of these problems or because the underlying value of what Satoshi wanted Bitcoin to be, but they've been forced to adopt Bitcoin because even though the volatility within Bitcoin and the crypto world, it's a lot more stable than some of the other fiat currencies out there right now. So it's how can we onboard these guys onto BRC20s, onto Ordinals again once it becomes seamless? We're not there yet, which is why it hasn't changed the game from a worldwide perspective, but it has changed the game within the Web3 or crypto circles from that aspect.
Yeah, and I think it's the basic point of the tagline that we've been coming up with on data stored in Bitcoin forever. That's a pretty interesting concept. I think it was always, for me, like IPFS and Arweave are great technical solutions, and they've been some of the building blocks of, I guess, the last bull run and whatever. But like, ask the man on the street, do they know what IPFS or Arweave are? And your NFTs that they may have bought, and they'll look blank. And you ask them what Bitcoin is, and they'll know, right? Like what most people should do right now. Like at least, and there's still that thing in the mind. I think that's the one thing that there's the solidity of data stored on Bitcoin, and then what that morphs into, I don't think we fully know. And then I think like there's some interesting elements with how the Bitcoin ecosystem operates. I didn't touch in earlier, but like probably a lot of people here have messed around on Ethereum. It's quite an expensive thing to do, right? So I have PTSD from $200 lost here, $500 lost here through just pressing the wrong button on Ethereum, and it happens more than we would like. And what's quite cool about Bitcoin is you have like the partially signed Bitcoin transactions where effectively, from a trading analogy, if you only really get your fill if the transaction completes, and you don't have to pay any money, right? Like, so the crazy gas costs and the smart contract errors that like everyone loves the freewheeling innovation of the Ethereum and the EVM ecosystem, but at the same time, it's like they're very sharp knives to go into the kitchen with, and like Bitcoin and Ordinals are a bit more user friendly on like the PSPT angle, where data's stored, like how the UTXO architecture of Bitcoin works, where each data is stored on individual sats, and it's referenceable forever. So that it's really nice to see that ecosystem being turbocharged, because it's still you've got huge bullishness around it at the same time, with like the Bitcoin ETFs like likely to being improved, and I think it's nice that that's coming at a wave where some innovation is coming onto Bitcoin at the same time.
Cool. Okay, we've got one question here down the front.
A related but very simple question. In dollar terms, if I wanted to inscribe something like CoinScrum is great onto a sat, how much would it cost me? And how much of that is the network fees, and how much is Ordinals Vault's thing? Just a rough idea.
So it would probably cost you like $1 to $2. You could probably use our Markdown tool, and like text files are pretty cheap. You could probably like figure out ways to spend even less, but and then we typically take a 10% cut. So just like and then work with different providers at scale where we can take a bit less. But basically, so like it's interesting, and people like tinkering around, and then they're figuring out ways to do that in a cheaper way. But we have an API and we have a text file. We're always trying to keep an eye on what the other different groups are charging as well, and try and match that. But we like the model of where, like, I think we put $21 million worth of Bitcoin chain fees on chain. So we like having a bit of a cut of that, because it allows us to run the business around it.
But he will give you a discount if you subscribe on that.
Yeah. We should get Nat a code.
Discount code.
A CoinScrum code. What I was going to say is, so with tokens, we're talking about BRC20s as well, right? How many people in here have heard of Tarot on Lightning? Okay, so a few people. So could you guys possibly try and break down the difference between Taproot tokens and BRC20 tokens, which are basically the same thing, but yeah, there is a fine line between the two.
Yeah, the Taproot assets. I have to admit, I haven't been like with the Taproot assets are very much on our radar, and I think we someone in our Slack recently when Taproot bought, because we actually like our team typically ship, like there was a craze around stamps that some people really deep into this niche might have heard of. So we built a stamp spot. We did someone did like an Ordinals Litecoin fork. We actually did quite well on that. That caught on quite a bit in the Litecoin community. Going, oh yeah, we can do an Ordinal because like Litecoin also has a UTXO model. Taproot assets. But one thing that's a big weakness about Taproot assets is Casey, who is he makes Vitalik Buterin look like a great leader. Because and which he probably is, to be fair. But Casey just changes his mind every so often. So Casey went behind these kind of Taproot assets that were maybe looking to leverage Taro, and got like an entire funded team then sprung up to like build this thing within a month of him doing the tweet. And then he shipped this idea called Runes that he also like. So I think the reality is, from a product market fit, BRC20 is here. Taproot assets are like a lot of the experimental stuff, like stamps or whatever, where you've got teams building the infrastructure to do it, but no one's really like, there isn't an ecosystem of users around it, right? Like I think BRC. At the moment, the fungible token game on Bitcoin is BRC20s to lose, but they're a bit like VHS Betamax, right? Like they've got the traction like VHS. Most people hate the architecture of BRC20 because like they're on-chain, on Bitcoin. So the moment there's a spike and a whole bunch of BRC20 activity, it clogs up all of Bitcoin with people getting their non-fungible tokens. So like you literally have the mempool on Bitcoin getting crowded out by like someone going, like some like token craze taking off, which is the next meme coin or whatever. So I think even Domo, who's been, I think actually quite a bit more mature than Casey in terms of like trying to think out a long form strategy for BRC20. Like he's really trying to drive that as to something that there's ways to take some of that friction out, but I think BRC20 is very much there. Taproot assets is there in the experimental stage, and then maybe Runes pops up and also gains some popularity and won't clog up the Bitcoin mempool as much, but maybe harder to do at scale.
Yeah, I think probably one thing to add is if you're thinking of which one to use, it's for higher value items or higher value aspects to leverage BRC20, because that's when you don't mind paying the higher gas fee for. It might be needs for a house, for example, but if it's just a standard token from an ecosystem, then Lightning makes a lot more sense because you don't need everything to be on chain, where aspects of that on chain, it doesn't actually affect the speed of the transactions because it's leveraging the Lightning network. But again, that's maybe a bit more future thinking from where we are today.
Okay, cool. So one for maybe Mohammed to start with this time.
Yeah, me.
So, seeing as you guys are exploring Bitcoin in the metaverse, right? Can we talk about a little bit more about what you guys are doing, and also kind of like where this idea came from in the kind of sense of Bitmap? I think was the first project to launch that was like, okay, we're going to try and put metaverse on Bitcoin.
So it's interesting. I really like what the Bitmap guys are doing because it is fully decentralized. Whereas what we're going for, there is more levels of centralization prior to decentralizing. I know Ben, who's the founder and CEO of Darewise, has been speaking with the founder of Bitmap and there's been good communications there. I love what the Bitmap team are doing, but for us, it's very different. It's not just this is a closed community for us. To the point I was making earlier, it's a lot more about being an open ecosystem, but we do want different launch contributors to come on board. And it's all, what does that actually mean? If you're contributing something, are you contributing tooling? Are you contributing a destination? When we say destination, we're doing maybe games or metaverse experience. So it's really how can you add value to this ecosystem? And something I've said earlier and I'll say again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We've got so many great builders within the Bitcoin ecosystem, but if they really have the Web2 mindset of I'm going to go it alone, the likelihood of success diminishes. But if there's something where you can tap into the different players within that ecosystem, where everyone is happy to be like, right, I'll have a smaller share of the pie, but it's a much bigger pie that all of us can share because we're looking to build this narrative forward. There is a very strong narrative for that, where it fundamentally comes down to what motivates different people in the space. Some people genuinely want to make a difference. Others, it's just how can we leverage a new hype on Bitcoin to make an ROI, and that's it. And then again, it's a spectrum. So again, they're two personas, but there are many more personas, and it's always this fight of good versus evil, of builders versus speculators. And they're not necessarily exclusive groups, but how can we get more builders coming into this ecosystem so we can leverage the power of Bitcoin, we can leverage that locked liquidity that I was alluding to, we can leverage the fact that people know what Bitcoin is. They don't understand how it works, but they've still heard of Bitcoin. There is still a level of trust in Bitcoin because the narrative in the news now is nowhere near as negative around Bitcoin, maybe even Ethereum, as it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and all of crypto was a scam. All of the big private banks were claiming it's all going to go to zero. They now all have trading desks, and what do they trade? Mainly Bitcoin and Ethereum. So there's been a big change in narrative, which is why, specific to the Bitcoin ecosystem, we are still early because we don't have, BRC20 is the front runner right now when we think of fungible tokens on Bitcoin. But we still haven't seen, it would be great to come back a year from now and be like, is BRC20 still the number one? Is it runes? Has everyone moved to Lightning? Is there, there's BitVM that was announced 10 days, 2 weeks ago, even though it's still very, very early in what you can do within BitVM. But there are so many new ideas, and I know you mentioned Casey. Casey, for me, is excited. There are so many different possibilities of what can happen. It's a bit like, well, if you have the wind in your sails, you have to use that to your advantage. So it's like, all right, let's build something here, let's build something there. It reminds me of Polygon. Polygon have 4 different ZK EVM standards or layer 2s coming out because they've put funds into different teams who are going for slightly different architectures around that. So I don't see an issue with being excited as long as you're responsible. Maybe he isn't that responsible, which is a different topic.
Okay, and I just want to get you guys' thoughts as well on because since you guys have both come up, we mentioned like Bitcoin L2s, right? Most of this is about happening on L2s and this on L3s. The other day there was some controversy around Lightning Network, wasn't there? With a very old exploit coming back to hold the Lightning Network. So what do you feel about, or what are your thoughts around, shall I say, maxis, like as you said, like laser-eyed maxis who are like Lightning Network or no other L2? Like, we know Lightning's very good for scalability, obviously, but again, when it comes to functionality, HLTCs, which is the actual thing that the exploit was founded, funnily enough, are not, I don't think they've got enough breadth for doing complex activity with smart contracts. So what are you guys' thoughts around Lightning versus everything else?
From a high level, it doesn't actually make a difference because we're not going to hit mainstream adoption of any of these today or in the next 6 months. So it's fundamentally what lasts the test of time, what's going to have the easiest user experience. And I always like to compare to ChatGPT. How many of us have used ChatGPT? Okay, this is the most hands up we've seen. Why? Because it's easy to use. I sign in with Google and it's done. It's one interface that I interact with. Yeah, when it comes to crypto, regardless if it's Bitcoin, if it's Ethereum, there are so many different interfaces. There are so many different layers for us to be engaging with. It's confusing. I remember telling a friend about wanting to buy an NFT. Cool. You need to go KYC on an exchange. What's a KYC? Why do I need to do that? Well, you need to do that to buy Ethereum. You then need to send Ethereum to your MetaMask. What's a MetaMask? Okay, so let's take a step back. You create a MetaMask, you're going to get these 12 words, write them down on a piece of paper. Why can't I just say it on my phone? It's complex. And once you've done that, you then have to bridge your Ethereum to Polygon. It's so complicated. It's so complicated. Yet the ChatGPT example is, it's so easy. until we have that level of ease and accessibility, it doesn't really make a difference what's happening on this layer, because it's not ready to be adopted by everyone on this layer. And again, this is just my high level opinion around that.
Yeah, and Lightning is a really, really interesting thing. Like for years, it's probably been the greatest app technology that no one uses, right? It's very frustrating because if Nat's probably got a Lightning wallet, I've got a Lightning wallet, we could go out to dinner, and probably the easiest way for us to split a bill is from sending Lightning. It happens almost instantaneously, pretty much no fee, and is a great way to kind of be moving around Bitcoin on that for the transactional element of the layer 2. I think Taro is very, very experimental. It's like DeFi layer, and obviously like other layer 2. Like I know Nat's very close to Stacks, for example. They're one of the more sophisticated chains. Again, suffering from, I think all of the Bitcoin layer 2s, the users are really the developers, right? And some of the odd speculator tinkerer, it's not. It's all of them are a bit of a graveyard at the moment. But then out of that, I think what you get is with the traction of something like Ordinals, which does definitely have a user base that is non-zero. You then get the use cases on the layer 2s. As a team as well, we've been brainstorming actually we need to put in the work to make it easy for people using the EVM chains to tether onto Ordinals, because probably they're a far bigger user base, and why wouldn't they want to at least think about storing data on Bitcoin rather than IPFS or outweighing, right? So I think it's really, really interesting. I think a lot of those layer 2s, I think, have definitely got a lot of buzz around them. I think Lightning actually, Ordinals was one of the major first use cases for Lightning. Like when we had it integrated into it actually was where, because people needed to transact very, very quickly to capture value on Ordinals, Lightning became perfect, and it is nice. And so I think the interesting thing from the Maxi's point of view is actually the Ordinals and the DeFi creativity will fuel the tools of the thing that might be their pet project. If it's Lightning to protect the chain, it's kind of actually the first thing that drove people en masse to use Lightning was Ordinals becoming really, really popular. And then I think once that user experience of Lightning, because once you've got other people, once you've got the counterparty of someone else on Lightning is a great user experience. But if you don't know anyone and there's no way you can transact with your Lightning, it's not a very good user experience.
Trust me on that one. Yeah, I agree on that last one. So, to everybody in here who hasn't really checked out Ordinals yet, or hasn't really joined any Ordinal communities, can you guys recommend, including your own obviously, some Ordinals communities that they could join, and some places that they might be able to find out some more information?
As opposed to communities, maybe apps you can download. So Xverse is an excellent wallet, and from there you can begin your journey into discovering the different Ordinal collections, which then leads onto the communities. So that would be a recommendation. There's Ordzar as well. I know the founder. They're doing some very interesting things, like a marketplace /Bazaar, hence the name Ordzar. But they're doing a lot of things in Southeast Asia, speaking to different government arms, government bodies as well, in terms of how they can leverage Bitcoin and the Bitcoin ecosystem. So there'd be two places to start. Obviously, go on Twitter, and you just have to type in #Ordinals, and you can find a lot of stuff on there as well. But I know you are a lot deeper in the space than I am, so maybe something a bit more concise.
And I think on the Twitter element, the Ordinals show was a good listen. And actually, to your question, my good friend Trevor, was he was one of the founders of this Ordinals show, and him and a bunch of the people who run all of the like there's 4 people who do it most are like talking for like they're a bit crazy, and they talk for like 5 hours on Twitter Spaces. I was sitting next to him at dinner the other night, and he was literally sent out 30 tweets while he was sitting next to me at dinner, which was intriguing. So he's like living his life online, and the whole of that Ordinals show crew have become like fully, but they're very educational. So I think it's a good, as well as Xverse or the Lever apps are pretty good as like the portal of where you can store an Ordinal and then try and transact on, like try and do one on Ordinals bot, try and transact with them on like Magic Eden or Unisat or Ordinals wallet or wherever Ords are. The interesting thing about Ords are is they've got like a partnership with like the Balinese government and various other people to sort of bring Ordinals to emerging markets in some way. I don't know what will go on with that, but I met the founder a few weeks ago, so there's a lot of people tinkering around and doing interesting things. I think like one of the cool things about our platform is you can log on and get any rare sat that you might want. So you could like literally pay a premium of like $1 and get that text file you wanted to inscribe on a pizza sat, right? And that's quite cool, right? Like to be able to have something that's been in Hal Finney's wallet or in the original Bitcoin pizza transaction, and then I think there's a whole bunch of different like use cases and things going on. I think it's going to be that's probably like the best tools are like we're putting out a lot of information and blogs, and we do Medium posts, and our Twitter feed is probably quite a good place to look. But there's a lot of information, and we're trying to do a lot more to do that. The Bitcoin Magazine guys who invested in Ordinals bot and run like Bitcoin Miami and Bitcoin Amsterdam, I think they're rolling out the red carpet for Ordinals, and it's really good. Like the editor of Bitcoin Magazine is like fully like I sat next to him the other night, and he was like fully into Ordinals, and like we were chatting about like maybe we could like inscribe each article that had ever been in Bitcoin Magazine onto Bitcoin. So I think there's going to be a lot, but probably Bitcoin Magazine and the Ordinals show are some of the better information sources.
Great. And just so as a bit of a shout out there as well, on top of that, there are the 2 major Ordinals events that happened in last year as well. There's the Ord conference that happened in Miami, and then there's also Inscribe that happened just recently in Amsterdam. So there are actual whole conferences and galleries popping up all over the place for Ordinals. So without further ado, let's say thank you and give our speakers another round of applause for tonight. It's been wonderful to have them down and explore this kind of, I want to say new trend, but it's also innovation that is happening on Bitcoin. Thank you very much to all of you for coming out tonight to come and check this out. There are some pizzas just been delivered towards the back, and there's plenty more refreshments, so please stick around. We'll be packing up at around 10 to 9, and then by 9 o'clock we need to be up. Again, thanks a lot, and thanks to everybody for coming down. I'll be able to speak to you afterwards if you need anything. Cheers.